Okay, this PowerPoint is going to be a little bit longer, and it goes over camera basics as well as a few other things. So to start, more to review, the last PowerPoint I talked about stops, and this is kind of a visual representation of stops. So stop is either a halving of light or a doubling of light. And in relation to exposure, we talk about overexposed and underexposed. Of course, that can be by more than a stop, which these images are probably a little bit more like two stops to be really bright and really dark, but you get the idea, I think. When it comes to exposure, there are three different things that affect our exposure: our ISO, our shutter speed, and our aperture. So the ISO is a boosting of a signal, essentially, to make the camera more or less sensitive. Shutter speed is the time that the shutter is open, and it controls whether we have frozen motion or if motion gets blurred. And aperture is going to control our depth of field. And I think a visual example of that is going to be easier to understand, but basically the range of what's in focus. When we're looking at things with our human eye, we just use muscles and quickly focus on different things at different distances. So it seems like everything is always in focus. But in a camera, you have one focal distance, and then you have a range of what is in sharp focus. So with ISO, a standard kind of the native ISO in a camera is going to be 100 ISO, and then it doubles in sensitivity up 200, 400, 800, so on and so forth. Some cameras go up to like 6400 or 128,000 ISO, which is really extreme. I would always recommend that you photograph with the lowest ISO possible in order to get a sharp picture. I'll kind of explain that a little bit more later, but the idea is that if you're going to end up with something blurry with camera shake or something like that, you up your ISO in order to use a faster shutter speed in order to get sharp pictures. Okay, so ISO changes the sensitivity of our camera, but also changes these other three things. So with a lower sensitivity comes less noise. Back in the days of film, it was kind of easy to understand because basically your film had smaller or larger clusters of sensitive material, silver halides. And so if you had larger silver halides, it was more sensitive, but because of that, you had more noticeable noise or more noticeable graying. But with digital cameras, it's just an amplification or lower level of amplification for your, what I'm trying to say, the noise becomes more noticeable when it's amplified more. Basically, the signal has more static in it. So along with that, also you get more contrast when you have a lower ISO. And if I didn't say it already, detail, but I think you can read a slide too, right? Okay, so here's a visual of that. So a low ISO versus a high ISO. So obviously, noise is not something that we really typically want. So the lowest ISO you can get and have a sharp picture is what you should go with. I normally recommend you start around 100 ISO because it's the native. A lot of other people say, 400 kind of works for any condition. So, but anywhere between 100 and 400, you're probably fine. Once you go above 800 or at 800 or above, you tend to notice some noise. All right, so here's a visual example of what different apertures look like. And these are the sort of standard numbers. I should have said this before I talked about ISO, but we talk about full stop ISOs. And these are kind of the numbers that are on a traditional film camera. Digital cameras tend to have in-between stops of either a third stop or half a stop. So if your camera has different numbers than these, that's probably what they are, is they're the in-between stops. Doesn't mean that they're bad to use. It's just that we tend to memorize these in the doubling and halving increments that are traditional. So most cameras these days start usually around a 5.6 aperture. when you have a standard size lens, and it goes up to maybe 22 or even 32. But some cameras will have apertures that open up even larger and let more light in, equivalent to everything else. And those are usually more expensive because they let more light in, but they're better for certain conditions. Okay. So looking at those numbers and looking at the range, the thing I should note is that remember that a smaller number is actually a larger size hole. That's a very important thing, that they're kind of reversed in relationship to kind of what you would think of as mathematical larger and smaller. So a small aperture number lets in more light. It also has less depth of field. And then a higher number, more light, or sorry, less light, because it's a smaller hole, but more range of what's in focus. So here's an illustration that is, it's not a photographic illustration. I've got a photographic illustration on the next slide, but this is a kind of visual representation of this really, really, really weird shaped unbalanced tree. Funny, okay. And a small small depth of field being represented with a very large opening. So what's in front of the fourth bird is out of focus, and what's behind the fourth bird is out of focus. Whereas when you go with a mid-range aperture, or what is kind of the largest on most cameras these days, at least a standard lens, you get like 3 birds in focus. And then with a really small hole, you get a really large amount of what's in focus, and the whole tree becomes in focus. Okay, so here's my photographic illustration. There is 2 young boys and this really creepy man in the background. Sorry, it's a little pixelated in this view, but basically the representation here is that you have in the left picture a very large opening hole, large aperture, which gives you a small depth of field. So the focus is on the boy in the middle, and in the left image, the boy in the front and the creepy man in the background are both out of focus. But when you change that to an aperture like 22, the range gets so increased that all 3 of them and everything around them become in sharp focus. And then here's my third visual example of that. And what I like about this is that you can see the numbers in the bottom. So the distance from the camera to the subject, which is not really a person, so I feel we're calling a subject maybe still life, remains the same. The ISO, you'll notice across all of them, remains the same. And then the aperture and shutter speed change. And what these are is that if you're starting with a 1.8 aperture and you go to a 4, that's going to be 3 stops of light. So we go from 1.8 to 2 to 2.8 to 4. So that's 3 stops less light on the aperture and 3 stops more light in the shutter speed. So the shutter speed's 500, and it slows down from 500 to 250 to 125, which is actually only 2 stops. So that doesn't quite add up, but they should be equivalent. And then you go from an aperture 4 to 8, so that's 2 more stops, less light. And then we go from a 125th, it should be, to a 60th of a second, and then to a 30th of a second. So those aren't exact, but they're close in amount of light coming into the camera is the point. So we're focused on the same spot, we're the same distance away. All that's changing is really the appearance of depth of field. So I think this is pretty clear to see that the background particularly becomes more in sharp focus when we go to a smaller hold aperture. Okay, switching gears in terms of shutter speed. So shutter speed in traditional cameras was done with a wound up spring that you'd wind up tighter or looser. And so they're, again, halving and doubling of times. But if you go from essentially a second on down, what I should note here is that these numbers that are represented are what you would see in your camera, but they're actually supposed to be fractions of a second. So it's 1 second, and when you see a number 2, it's actually a half of a second, and a quarter of a second, eighth of a second, 15th of a second, 30th of a second, 60th of a second, so on and so forth. Now these aren't exact doubling and halvings. Note between the 8 and 15, the 60 and the 125, but when you're talking about fractions of a second, they're in the ballpark. So at 1 second, most moving things become blurry. At 1,000th of a second, most moving things are pretty well frozen. The range can go beyond these. Some cameras, particularly SLRs, will let you go 2 seconds, 4 seconds, all the way up to about 30 seconds usually. And then after 30 seconds, you'd have to have a remote to tell the camera how long to stay open or to keep the shutter open. A lot of cameras also, I should say, go beyond 1,000th of a second. But I would say in most circumstances, you're going to be at a 30th of a second to maybe a 250th or a 500th of a second. And there's not really much need to go beyond those, except for special conditions. Special conditions, I guess I should say, would be like sports photography. If you want to freeze a runner or a sports player of some sort, 1,000th of a second or beyond might be necessary. But if you want to do like night photography, you'd always go beyond 1 second. You'd go, 10, 20, 30 seconds for, at least in the city, for most pictures, you wouldn't have to go much longer than that.